Radio Algeria International, our voice in the world.
This is the English service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
The 10th high-level seminar on peace and security in Africa opened today in Iran under the chairmanship of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf. The Minister of Trade and Export Promotion, Taib Zitouni, has announced Algeria's official adhesion to the Guided Trade Initiative as part of the implementation of the Agreement of the African Continental Free Trade Area, SLECAF. As the United Kingdom and Germany have called for a sustainable ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli army has pursued its airstrikes against the northern and central parts of the territory. Those were the headlines, and now the news in detail from Radio Algeria International. First, the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmadjid Tebboune, has extended his condolences to the Crown Prince of the brother country, Kuwait, Sheikh Mash'al Al-Hamad Al-Jaber Al-Sabah, following the death of the Emir Sheikh Nawaf Al-Ahmed Al-Sabah. His funeral took place today as part of a private ceremony held in the presence of members of the ruling family and relatives. The 10th high-level seminar on peace and security in Africa today opened in Iran under the chairmanship of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf. The meeting was attended by the head of the African Union Peace and Security Council, Gambian Foreign Minister Mamadou Tangara, as well as by the AU Peace and Security Commissioner Bankole Adoye. The meeting also brought together experts and representatives of the UN and AU institutions. The Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf, has underlined that Algeria will devote its next mandate at the UN Security Council to strengthen the influence of the African continent in the process of making relevant decisions based on its common positions and the principles, values, and ideals enshrined in the constitutive Charter of the African Union. In his speech during the opening of the 10th High-Level Conference on Peace and Security in Africa, Attaf said that the UN body is in desperate need of Africa's voice of wisdom, commitment, and responsibility.
عملا بتوجيهات السيد رئيس
Under the instructions of the President of the Republic, Algeria will devote its next mandate at the Security Council in full coordination with its brothers from the republics of Mozambique and Sierra Leone to represent Africa in the best way within this central UN body. Algeria will endeavor to strengthen the influence of our continent in the process of making relevant decisions based on its common positions and the principles, values, and ideals enshrined in the constitutive Charter of the African Union.
With regard to the challenges besetting the African continent on account of the deteriorating security situation, Mr. Attaf emphasized that a high sense of responsibility should be shown in tackling the many challenges and developments to which the world, and Africa in particular, are confronted.
I mean the challenges, those which are imposed on us by the deteriorating security and political situation at a broader level and with an increasing pace at the level of our continent, notably in the Sahel-Saharan region. This region, which has become a reference for the lack of security and stability amid surging terrorism and organized crime and increasing hotbeds of tensions and conflicts, in addition to the phenomenon of unconstitutional changes of governments. All these developments and transformations impose a new reality that we should tackle with a high sense of responsibility.
And evoking the situation in the Palestinian territories, and notably in Gaza, the Algerian diplomacy chief underlined that the besieged enclave has become a graveyard for the human rights and the fundamental principles of legal rights, adding that the current developments will see the whole international system changed.
في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة
In the occupied Palestinian territories, Gaza has become a graveyard, and for the fundamental principles of legal rights on which the current international system is based upon and which were meant to remain a main reference and for all, far from any segregation, indiscrimination or exclusion. How can Palestinian civilians be deprived from their right to protection, and how can the calls and outcries of the UN Secretary General be turned a deaf ear, and how can the Israeli colonialist settler occupation benefit from all facilitations to decimate an entire people without any accountability? We are undoubtedly before a decisive turning point that will certainly draw the future of the whole international system.
You are listening to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Mr. Ahmed Attaf, speaking at the opening of the 10th High-Level Seminar on Peace and Security in Africa, which opened today in the western city of Oran. Over to you, Miriam.
And now the Minister of Trade and Export Promotion, Tayyip Zitouni, has announced Algeria's official adhesion to the Guided Trade Initiative as part of the implementation of the agreement of the African Continental Free Trade Area (ZLECAf).
Algeria is the 8th country to join the space after examining all the legal procedures and the presidential decrees that were signed. Today we announced that we adhere to this initiative as a real launch of trade exchanges without customs constraints and tax barriers. It's a space for common exchange for more than 38 African countries, and which enables the member states of this initiative of guided trade to strongly take off and achieve the hopes of the African peoples for economic integration.
In a speech delivered during the proceedings of the Economic Forum on the Guided Trade Initiative held in the presence of the Secretary General of the ZLECAf zone, Wamkili Mene, Mr. Zitouni indicated that by virtue of his membership, economic operators can carry out commercial exchanges with their counterparts in the initiative partner countries without custom constraints in accordance with the ZLECAf agreement. Mr. Zitouni called on Algerian economic operators to take advantage today of the incentives granted as part of trade with the countries having joined this initiative in order to promote Algerian exports outside hydrocarbons to achieve the objective of the ZLECAf agreement aimed at significantly increasing the volume of trade exchanges among African countries. For his part, the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area (ZLECAf), Wamkili Mene, has welcomed Algeria's adhesion to the Guided Trade Initiative without customs barriers, launched as part of the achievement of the ZLECAf agreement, hailing on the occasion Algeria's steps aimed at strengthening its commercial presence in different African states. In a speech delivered during the proceeding of the Economic Forum on the Guided Trade Initiative held in the western province of Oran, Mr. Mene welcomed the efforts of Algeria and the various initiatives launched by the government for an opening to the African market and commercial expansion in the continent, recalling the opening of a new air and maritime lines between Algeria and African countries and the opening of Algerian banking subsidiaries in these countries, which reflects the expansion of the presence of the Algerian banking sector in African countries. The African official also welcomed the major steps taken by Algeria in terms of industry capable of bringing added value to the country and doubling inter-African trade. And now, as the United Kingdom and Germany have called for a sustainable ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli army has pursued its airstrikes against the northern and central parts of the territory. Palestinian sources said 35 people died in the raids that hit the refugee camp of Jabalia, stressing that the death toll may increase as many victims remain under the rubble. Several other people died in similar strikes carried out by the Israeli army in the southern town of Beni Sueila, as fighting continued in the town of Gaza. In this respect, the World Health Organization said that the emergency services of the El Shifa hospital in the northern part of Gaza turned into a bloodshed as it shelters hundreds of wounded who are joined by newcomers every minute. The United Nations has put at 1.9 million the number of people who have been displaced by the war that devastated the territory. The attacks launched over 2 months ago by the Israeli forces on Gaza have so far claimed nearly 19,000 lives. This came as the UK Foreign Minister David Cameron and his German counterpart Annalena Baerbock said that there was an urgent need for a sustainable ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, where so many civilians die. In a contribution carried by the Sunday Times, the two men said they, however, opposed the idea of calling for an immediate and general ceasefire now. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Hamas movement said it had informed the mediators in its refusal to start any negotiations with the Israeli occupying authorities on an exchange of prisoners unless they put an end to their acts of aggression against the Palestinian people. It is worth noting that the protests were staged notably in Spain and the United States to press for an end to be put to the genocide and massacres carried out by the Israeli army in Gaza. Back to you, Mohammed.
And the people of Chad went to the polls today as part of a referendum on the new constitution or supposed to open the way to new elections. According to press correspondents, the vote is likely to secure a majority of votes. The provisional results are due to be released on December 28, pending their approval by the Supreme Court. The transition president, Mohamed Idris Deby, aged 37, was appointed on April 20, 2021, following the death of his father, Idris Deby Into, killed by rebels. Today's voting came ahead of legislative and presidential elections due to be held on October 2024 at the latest. And the United States has warned that the recent fighting between the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support paramilitary forces threatens the civilians and humanitarian operations, calling for a halt to be put to their advance towards Wad Madani, a city where thousands of Sudanese have sought refuge. According to the UN, near 500,000 displaced people sought refuge in the Sudanese state of Gezira, with more than 86,000 in Wad Madani. The fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support paramilitary forces has extended to the city, which resulted in the suspension of the UN aid to the state. With this last piece of news, we come to the end of this news bulletin. Time now for a reminder of the major headlines. The 10th high-level seminar on peace and security in Africa opened today in the western province of Oran under the chairmanship of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Mr. Ahmed Attaf. And the Minister of Trade and Export Promotion, Tayyip Zitouni, has announced Algeria's official adhesion to the Guided Trade Initiative as part of the implementation of the agreement of the African Continental Free Trade Area, SLICAF. And as the United Kingdom and Germany have called for a sustainable ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli army has pursued its airstrikes against the northern and central parts of the territory. And with this, we come to the end of this news bulletin for today. Time now for our weekly program, starting with the economic program by my colleague Saïd Boughazi. This will be followed by another program on the situation, on the health situation in the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian territories as a whole. And with this, we'll come to the end of it. We'll meet you again tomorrow for a fresh edition of our news bulletin in English. Until then, stay tuned to Radio Algeria International, and bye-bye for now.
Hi and welcome to our weekly program devoted to Algerian economic news. First in the news, the Minister of Finance, Laziz Faid, has stated that the amended and supplemented insurance law presented by the government will help strengthen the adaptation and governance of insurance companies and the role of the supervisory bodies while improving the quality of the services provided to customers. The Minister was speaking at the ceremony to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the creation of the National Insurance Company SR and the granting of the approval to carry out insurance activities at the international conference Centre Abdelatif Rahad here in Algiers in the presence of former CEOs of insurance companies, banks and financial institutions and representatives of public and private bodies. The Economic and Financial Affairs Committee of the Council of the Nation has held a meeting to examine the Council's draft budget for 2024, according to a press release from this legislative body. The meeting, chaired by Miloud Hanafi, chairman of the committee, was devoted to a presentation by the Secretary General of the Council, Mohamed Drisi Dada, in which he stated that the preparation and adoption of the draft budget of the Council of the Nation are part of the principle of financial and administrative autonomy enjoyed by this body and comply with the rules and measures governing it. The Permanent Secretariat of the African Conference has elected Algerian Nassima Arhab by a majority to the post of Secretary General, according to a press release issued by the Ministry of Knowledge Economy, Startups and Micro-Enterprises. The plebiscite of Mrs. Arhab, who holds the post of Secretary General of the Ministry of Knowledge Economy, Startups and Micro-Enterprises, took place at the end of the second session of the African Conference, held from 5th to 7th December in Algiers, with representatives from 32 African countries, as the press release. In more Algerian economic news, the local development bank BDL and the Company for the Automation of Interbank Transactions and Electronic Banking, SATIM, have signed a partnership agreement to process locally the data relating to banking transactions using international MasterCard payment cards issued by national banks. Under the terms of the agreement, BDL will support SATIM in its project aimed at the gradual nationwide processing of data relating to banking transactions carried out using international MasterCard payment cards issued by national banks. The head of the Islamic Finance Department at the National Bank of Algeria, BNA, Amina Atamnia, has told the press on the sidelines of the inauguration ceremony of a new branch of the bank in El Mouradia dedicated to Islamic finance, said that the value of Islamic finance from its launch on 4th August 2020 to 11 December 2023 amounted to more than 10 billion dinars, including all the financial products on offer. According to the manager, the number of Islamic finance products offered increased from 9 products in 2020 to the current 14, in addition to preparing for the launch of new products, some of which are currently awaiting marketing authorization from the Bank of Algeria. The Center for the Development of Entrepreneurship at the University of Algiers, Ben Youssef Ben Khadda, has organized an exhibition aimed at encouraging the entrepreneurial spirit among young people and explaining the procedures involved in launching their own projects. The event, attended by several public and private Algerian institutions and startups, was an opportunity to provide comprehensive explanations to students and project the stages involved in setting up a startup or micro-enterprise and the procedures for obtaining the startup label, explaining the advantages offered by support and funding. And to wrap it up, the Central Director at the Ministry of Labour, Employment and Social Security, Mohamed Louail, has affirmed that the process of digital transformation in the labour sector is gathering pace, recalling the many actions undertaken by this department to this end. Mohamed Louail was speaking at a meeting entitled The Digital Transformation of Organizations, the Prerequisites for Human Resources Management, organized at the Higher School of Social Security, Mohamed Saleh Menturi, by the Labour, Employment and Social Security Laboratory in collaboration with the Management Governance, Innovation and Organizational Performance Laboratory, MAGGIPO, in the presence of executives from the Ministry of Labour, various organizations and institutions, economic operators, researchers and students. And with this we come to the end of our weekly program devoted to Algerian economic news. Goodbye.
Welcome to this new edition of your weekly program, The Health Magazine, devoted today to the dire health situation prevailing in the occupied Gaza Strip on account of the ongoing Zionist attacks against innocent civilians and infrastructure. 500,000 Palestinians are at risk of hunger and thirst in cities where Israeli attacks continue, the Gaza municipality reported, describing the humanitarian situation as disastrous as the occupation army deliberately target food and water infrastructure. The municipality spokesman Husni Muhanna said that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is disastrous. He indicated that fuel shortages disrupted the process of evacuating the injured and transporting bodies, adding that the construction equipment and vehicles became unusable as a result of Israel's attacks. He stressed that water and food crisis in shelter centers is increasing exponentially as the number of people coming to these centers exceeds the capacity. In less than 60 days, the number of functioning hospitals has dropped from 36 to 18. Of these, 3 are only providing basic first aid, while the remaining hospitals are delivering only partial services. Those able to admit patients are delivering services well over their intended capacities, with some treating 2 to 3 times as many patients as they were designed for. The 12 hospitals that are still operational in the south are now the backbone of the health system. The World Health Organization (WHO) has expressed grave concern over the resumption of hostilities, including heavy bombardment in Gaza, and reiterates its appeal to Israel to take every possible measure to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, as stipulated by the laws of war. UNICEF, for its part, called the Gaza Strip the most dangerous place in the world for children, underlining that scores of children are being killed and injured on a daily basis. Entire neighborhoods where children used to play and go to school have been razed to the ground with no sign of life in them. Close to 1 million children in Gaza have been forcibly displaced from their homes, according to UNICEF. This week, more than a dozen member states of WHO submitted a draft resolution that urged Israel to respect its obligation under international law to protect humanitarian workers in Gaza. The text of the draft resolution was examined on Sunday during a special session of the WHO's Executive Board convened to discuss the health situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. It was proposed by Algeria, Bolivia, China, Egypt, Indonesia, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Malaysia, Morocco, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. Palestinian representatives have WHO observer status and were also signatories to the proposal. The member states expressed their grave concern about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East al-Quds, especially the military operations in the Gaza Strip. They called for Israel to respect and protect medical and humanitarian workers exclusively involved in carrying out medical duties, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities. Separately, WHO spokesman Christian Lindmeier told reporters on Friday that Gaza's health system was on its knees and could not afford to lose any other ambulance or a single hospital bed. Meanwhile, several aid charities have sounded the alarm about an apocalyptic situation in Gaza after more than 2 months of war, warning of starvation and an outbreak of infectious diseases. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres rang the alarm concerning the serious violation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, notably in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In his address to the UN Security Council during the extraordinary session on the vote of a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and which was vetoed by the US, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned against the total collapse of the UN humanitarian support system in Gaza.
There is a high risk of the total collapse of the humanitarian support system in Gaza, which would have devastating consequences. We anticipate that it would result in a complete breakdown of public order and increased pressure for mass displacement into Egypt. I fear the consequences could be devastating for the security of the entire region. We have already seen the spillover in the occupied West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. There is clearly, in my view, a serious risk of aggravating existing threats to the maintenance of international peace and security.
Guterres also evoked the dire security situation prevailing in the occupied territories and Gaza in particular, posing great threat to the UN personnel and killing a large number of them in the history of the UN organization.
The risk of collapse of the humanitarian system is fundamentally linked with the complete lack of safety and security for our staff in Gaza and with the nature and intensity of military operations which are severely limiting access to people in desperate need. The threat to the safety and security of United Nations staff in Gaza is unprecedented. More than 130 of my colleagues have already been killed, many with their families. This is the largest single loss of life in the history of our organization. Some of our staff take their children to work so they know they will live or die together.
The UN Secretary General drew the attention of the UN Security Council about the ordeal the Palestinians are going through and called for urgent actions to be taken to relieve their sufferings and secure a permanent ceasefire.
The people of Gaza are looking into the abyss. The international community must do everything possible to end their ordeal. I urge the Council to spare no effort to push for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, for the protection of civilians, and for the urgent delivery of life-saving aid. While we deal with the current crisis, we cannot lose sight of the only viable possibility for a peaceful future, a two-state solution on the basis of United Nations resolutions and international law, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. This is vital for Israelis, Palestinians, and for the international peace and security. The eyes of the world and the eyes of history are watching. It's time to act, and I thank you.
In his daily brief, the UN Secretary General spokesperson Stéphane Dujarric deplored the worsening situation in the Palestinian occupied territories, deploring the insufficient aid that is funneled into the Gaza Strip.
The Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs tells us that last night, 69 trucks carrying humanitarian supplies and 61,000 liters of fuel entered Egypt from Gaza. These quantities are nowhere near sufficient to meet overwhelming humanitarian needs in Gaza, not to mention that the complex lack of safety in Gaza is severely limiting access to people in need. Rafah was the main governorate in Gaza where limited aid distribution took place yesterday. In the adjacent Khan Yunis governorate, except for the delivery of medical supplies to 2 hospitals, aid distribution largely stopped due to the intensity of the ongoing hostilities. Also yesterday, the World Health Organization delivered trauma and emergency care supplies to the European Gaza Hospital and the Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis to cover the needs of some 4,500 hospital patients. This was the first delivery mission to those hospitals since November 29th, despite active hostilities ongoing in the area.
It is worth noting that the death toll from the merciless war Israel is waging against innocent Palestinian civilians has surpassed 19,000 people, most of whom are women and children, according to the Health Ministry. And with this, we come to the end of the special program of the Health Magazine devoted today to the dire health situation in the Palestinian territories, notably in besieged Gaza. Don't forget to join us next week for a fresh edition of our program. Until then, stay tuned to Radio Algeria International, and bye-bye for now.
Pour les Palestiniens, on les laisse crever. C'est ça qui est scandaleux.